Preamble is regarded as the summary or the introduction to the Constitution, which declares the basic values on which the Constitution is based. Preamble declares the aspiration and the ideals of the people of India. The aspirations are liberty, equality, justice, and fraternity. The ideals are sovereignty, democratic, socialist, secular, and republic. Today's lecture will be on sovereignty. India has divided social power. It therefore has a mixed constitution and divided sovereignty. This talk will discuss how Indian sovereignty is composed of the state, the Supreme Court, and the people. Today we have with us Professor Anush Kapadia from HSS department, who will be explaining us about sovereignty, and at the end of the lecture we will try to find out who is sovereign, the state or the people. So I would like to call Professor Anush Kapadia.
Thanks very much, Ritesh. Can everyone hear me? Sorry, I'm going to try and talk off the phone. I don't know if I'll be doing much explaining. This is just by way of trying to put together some thoughts on the concept of sovereignty, and particularly on the concept of Indian sovereignty. And I'd like to, before that, I'd like to thank the IIT Bombay for Justice Group for putting on this lecture series, which of course is very badly needed in this current moment. So I'll start. I'll try not to do too much dry political theory, but I will do a little of it. I can't promise the rest is not going to be dry. But what is sovereignty? Broadly speaking, authority within a particular territory, right? Or exercised by a state. So the question is, how do we configure this power? How do we share sovereignty? In colonial India, needless to say, who was the sovereign in colonial India?
British power.
The British king, right? The king of, now it's gone after. So obviously the most basic meaning of sovereignty in our context was sovereignty from British rule, right? The British king can no longer be our sovereign. Freedom therefore meant Indian people expressing their sovereignty, the right to rule themselves, not to be ruled by a foreigner. But note that it could not be, we colloquially call that period, independence or the transfer of power. It couldn't be the transfer of power. And this is where Professor Robinson also referred to this briefly in her lecture. We learned from the Irish constitution. The Indian constitution makers had to introduce some discontinuities into our constitution, because otherwise the act of freedom, the act of Indian sovereignty, would be in a sense an act of British Parliament. And that couldn't be the case, because then we are in a sense, that which is given can be taken away, right? Which is why our preamble says that in the end, we, in our Constituent Assembly, this 26th day of November, blah, 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 we do hereby adopt, enact, and give to ourselves this Constitution. We give it to ourselves. I don't know if people are familiar with that image of Napoleon crowning himself emperor. Right? Why did Napoleon crown himself emperor? The Pope was right there. But he didn't want to grant the Pope, the Brahmin as it were, that legitimacy of being able to sanctify his sovereignty. He grabbed the throne the crown as it were from the Pope and placed it on his own head. I crown myself. So we are in a sense, being a sovereign people means that we give to ourselves this constitution. Right? And there's also, we use this phrase colloquially. It has been going about in our lectures and in our meetings in the last 10 days, which have been fabulous. Thank you guys for that, everyone who has come. The Constitution didn't give us these rights. We use this phrase colloquially. The Constitution grants us fundamental rights and so on and so forth. No, these rights are inherent in us. Ambedkar didn't grant us these rights. He just wrote them down. Right? Those rights are fundamental. We fought for and won sovereignty from the British, and we asserted these rights for ourselves and then enshrined them in our constitution. Which is why democracy, right, we're called a social, a sovereign democratic republic is the original framing. And I know we're going to talk about democracy later in the series, but because we are a sovereign, we are the sovereign, we are a democratic sovereign, and that makes a difference. Right? This is why democracy is much more than merely majority rule. Democracy can never be just majority rule. Because all citizens, we, the people, all of the citizens must be able to see themselves in the state. Right? In a republican state, which is what we are, a civic state, not an ethnic state, but a civic state, all citizens, even the losers in the election, are still members of the state. Which is why in a democracy there can be no state religion. State religion is simply incompatible with democracy. Because those in a nation which has a multiplicity of religions, the minority religion will simply not see itself in the state. And that is ipso facto disrespecting the minority. Therefore, state religion is incompatible with democracy and incompatible with the kind of sovereignty that we have adopted. Similarly, by the way, with your immigration policy. There is one idea that, oh, we don't owe foreigners the same rights that we owe our citizens, right? We can't discriminate between citizens, but we can discriminate in terms of foreigners who we let into the country. After all, they are not citizens, they are non-citizens. To be sure, but if you discriminate the immigrant pool on the basis of religion, you are basically saying something like, we have enough of religion X here, we would like religion Y to come in. Right? So that is also disrespecting that set of people who are not reflected in that immigration rule. So immigration laws also have to be consonant with this spirit of sovereign democracy and republican democracy. So how is sovereignty configured? Obviously there are different forms of government. There's monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, and a republic is where people make the rules for themselves. In a republic, the people are sovereign. This is a very modern notion. There is a distinction, and this distinction comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's a 18th century French thinker on this. There is and there are people here who have taken my HS course, so I've 307, so forgive me for some repetition, but there is a clear distinction between the sovereign and the government for Rousseau. The sovereign is not the government. The sovereign is, if you like, the constituting power. And then the sovereign gives orders to the government, who is basically like a wazir. The government is a servant of the sovereign. And the government can be formatted in many different ways. For Rousseau, you can have a monarchy constituted by a sovereign people. That's still democratic in a sense, because the sovereign, the body has decided, and if you like, the constituent assembly has decided to make it a monarchy. That's fine, that's not inconsistent. Right, so this distinction between the sovereign and the government is very important, and where the locus of the sovereign power is going to be very important. This is an idea that starts coming up in the late 19th century in the American and French context, especially when they start writing down constitutions. Britain doesn't have a kind of written constitution, right? Britain has a parliament, but it doesn't have a constitution. In a sense, Britain's parliament is pre-modern, because Britain's parliament deals with everything from the plumbing rules in Northampton to the Act of Settlement, the basic deep constitutional rules. It's one parliament, it's a representative body to be sure, but it doesn't have this distinction between the sovereign and the government. And why is this an important distinction? Because for Rousseau, in a modern society, we can't all be representatives. There has to be a kind of division of labor. The sovereign, for the most part, does the constituting and then hands off power to the government according to the rules set up by the sovereign, right? We live in a complex modern society. You can't govern directly, even you have to govern through your representatives, but the rules that you set up, that is the sovereign power, the constituting power, and the government then sort of takes over from there. So that distinction is a very important distinction that we need to hang on to. And I'll just quote to you briefly, if I may, from this idea. We say we have a parliamentary sovereignty that's sort of inherited from the British, but it's quite American and French in its inspiration as well, although differently, as we'll see as well. So here's a longish quote from a Supreme Court judgment. The Supreme Court case is called A.K. Gopalan. You can go and look it up. It's circa 1950. And I forget who the justice is, but the quote goes as follows. There can be no doubt that the people of India have in exercise of their sovereign will, as expressed in the preamble, adopted the democratic ideal which assures the citizen the dignity of the individual and other cherished human values as a means to full evolution and expression of his personality, it says his, and in delegating, right, the sovereign has delegating, and in delegating to the legislature, the executive and the judiciary their respective powers in the constitution, the people have reserved to themselves, right? The constitution doesn't give us the right. We have the right. We've written it down in the constitution. We've delegated our powers to the government in this form of the legislature, the executive and the judiciary. And yet we have reserved to themselves certain fundamental rights, so-called, I apprehend, because they, meaning the people, the rights retained by the people and made paramount to the delegated powers, as in the American model, right? Which is to say, we created the Constitution, reserved the fundamental, we meaning the people, in our constituting power, which was expressed in the Constituent Assembly, brought together the Constitution, reserved for ourselves the fundamental rights and wrote them down. The Constitution didn't give us these rights, we had them and wrote them down. So why did we distribute power in the way that we did? Right? We have a very elaborate distribution of power, right? We have a federal structure, of course. We have a Supreme Court, all of these bodies set up by the Constitution. We have an election commission, a constitutional body. We have the CAG, the Comptroller Auditor General. We have the UPSC. Why was it distributed in this way? Broadly speaking, you want to think about the context of the national struggle. And there are kind of three aspects to the azadi, the freedom that we were fighting for in the nationalist movement. Of course, the first one is obvious, is freedom from the British. But it's also freedom from social evils and social injustice. Don't forget this. The independence movement was a social movement, it was a movement for social reform. The disgusting stain of untouchability, casteism, horrible patriarchy, right? Our society was ridden with backward practices, and they were called as such, backward practices. And this was also part of the injustice that we were fighting for coterminously with our freedom. So we were fighting for freedom from the British, we were fighting for freedom from injustice, and we were also fighting for freedom from poverty. We were an absolutely shattered economy. From the riches of the 15th and 16th century, we were reduced to an absolutely dependent economy, shattered, our economy absolutely shattered by years of colonial exploitation. So these are the three phases of the colonial struggle. And the configuration of Indian sovereignty was designed to kind of meet these goals, meet these three kind of tests of Indian freedom. Therefore, the state was positioned, and here we move to the second sovereign. If I'm talking about our three sovereigns, first is the sovereignty of the people. Now, secondly, we move to this idea of the state being sovereign. And because of this particular history and the particular agendas and the particular nationalist movement, the three dimensions that I mentioned of the nationalist movement, the state was positioned as the vanguard. In a sense, the state was positioned as more advanced, and society was seen a little bit in this framing as backward. And that the state was going to use state power to reform and bring social justice to a society ridden with these problems. And politics, by the way, the exercise of state power, is therefore seen as a noble pursuit. Hard to imagine now, you guys, in this day and age, but politics, public affairs, was precisely this noble pursuit, the exercise of state power for the agenda of making India free. Right? This is the legacy of the nationalist movement. So in a sense, what happens in the early post-colonial period is that the viceregal concentration of power that is already there in the colonial construct is retained in very large measure, very substantial measure. We take whole parts of the colonial state on board, but it's given a different kind of legitimation. It's legitimated now. This centralization is now legitimated, not in, of course, before it was the rule of empire. Now it is the rule of social justice. And this is the Nehruvian vision, of course. This is Nehru's vision. Using the state, we need a strong state to drive social and economic reforms, otherwise we're not going to get these reforms. They're not going to come automatically from society. The state has to reformat society, and it needs a large degree of centralization to do this. And in fact, so committed was Nehru and a few others to this idea that they were arguably willing to partition the country for it. Right? Because the undivided India would have been a much more federal India. Power would have been much more diffused. The large Punjabi landlords in undivided, in that part of what then became Punjab, Pakistan, was not going to yield up power, right? There was a much more, and there was the cabinet mission plan and so on and so forth, which had this vision of an undivided India that Nehru, Azad was on board with, and the Congress was on board with, but Nehru kind of scuppered it. The idea being that centralization was, and the state therefore, in the tradition of the French Revolution, the state, and not the American Revolution, and I can discuss that distinction later if you like, the state is positioned as the solution to the social question. Just like in the French Revolution. The French Jacobins wanted to modernize the backward French peasant and use state power in order to push that line. Right? So the state is a kind of revolutionary vanguard, our second sovereign. But Nehru, not many people in the Constituent Assembly shared this view. This was a very representative body, and it had, everyone, all sides of the political spectrum represented in it. Nehru and the Congress left, if you like, was only one part of it. What should this strong state do? Even someone like Patel, if he was pro a strong state, still begs the question: what should this strong state do? How can we check this state? And in a sense, the distributed nature of power in India. Power is not concentrated. We have different classes, we have different castes, we have different regions, and so on. And in a sense, our constitution, namely the rules by which we configure our sovereignty, also distributes power, reflecting this kind of division, right? And we fight out our differences. Just like we fought out our differences in the Constituent Assembly, we continue to fight out our differences in the design of this constitution. That is, in a sense, divided power, divided sovereignty, gives us this constitution that, by the way, has been amended, over 100 times? Probably one of the most amended constitutions in the world, right? Because we are a multi-headed, plural society. No one corner of society has, decisive power. If the capitalists had decisive power, we would have capitalist society. That's what capitalists do. They reformat society. When they have state power, they reform social power, they reformat society in their image and create capitalism. Right? But we have an emaciated form of capitalism because capitalists do not corner. They have substantial power, but not supervening power. And you can say the same for feudal interests and so on and so forth all the way down the line. So this division, in a sense, is a kind of axiom. It runs through everything. And it shows up in various places, not least of all in the debates in the Constituent Assembly and the very configuration of the Constitution itself and its continuous amendment. So who then is the final arbiter of the Constitution, right? Well, in our divided polity, it depends on who you ask, right? For those proponents of a strong state, and I would include everyone here from Nehru to Mrs. G to Patel to Mr. Modi and Mr. Shah. Of course, at one level the equivalence is false because the left was not driven by a racist and exclusionary agenda as the right is. However, on the level of state power, there is a congruence, right? On the level of the desire for a strong state. So who is the arbiter of the Constitution as far as the proponents of a strong state is concerned? It's Parliament, right? It's the Lok Sabha, expressing the will of the people. And notice there that that encodes a certain definition of democracy. Democracy then becomes basically about elections, and it can slide into majoritarianism. On the other hand, if you ask proponents of liberalism, who is the final arbiter of the constitution, and here comes our third sovereign, it's the Supreme Court, right? Acting on principle, on the principles of liberalism and liberal democracy and republicanism and so on, secularism, defending the principles from an overmighty state, whoever is in charge of that state, whether it's the strong left or the strong right, right? The Supreme Court, that's the job, that's the liberals' idea, right? So, and here it encodes a slightly different idea of democracy. Here democracy is not merely about elections, but about principles. That principles that have to be defended, and they can't necessarily therefore be defended always by a parliament that is going to be a numbers game. It's not always about the numbers, it's about the principles. And there the court comes into play. So who then is the final arbiter, right? Note that again this distinction between sovereignty and government is being played out even in the Constituent Assembly. Most members, I'm given to understand, of the Constituent Assembly considered that the Constituent Assembly was a more authoritative body than Parliament. It has constituting power, and Parliament is the mere government, is the wazir, right? That is what most sort of, if you like, liberal members, whether they were explicitly liberal or certainly on that spectrum, that is what they believe. But here's a quote from, well, perhaps you can guess whose this quote is from. This is from the Constituent Assembly debates. No Supreme Court, no judiciary can stand in judgment over the sovereign will of Parliament. Representing the will of the entire community, ultimately the whole Constitution is a creature of Parliament. Who said this? In the Constituent Assembly debates. The whole Constitution is a creature of Parliament. Sovereign will expressed in Parliament. This is Nehru. This is Nehru's view, and you can understand why. Because he's animated by a desire for a strong state in order to pursue a social justice agenda, in order to pursue an economic agenda. One typical way in which the sovereign is checked, of course, the parliament is checked, is by this stereotypical idea of the separation of powers. We all remember from our civics classes, you have the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, and this is a kind of a formula that comes from French thinkers and American thinkers, and you kind of functionally distribute power in this way, and the idea is therefore to achieve, and Americans are very proud of this, they think they've just cracked it, they've got the formula, and it just needs to be preserved and replicated. You create a kind of tripartite system, and each branch of government, the people within that branch, out of sheer self-interest of trying to retain the power of that branch, will fight for that corner and check the other two corners. And you will have a kind of equilibrium. You'll have a checks and balances between the three branches of government, and thereby it will remain roughly democratic. India didn't adopt this neat separation of powers, not at all. Right? We don't have this. Just think about it. The executive meaning the president, say, has legislative power. You can pass an ordinance. The judiciary has legislative power as well. When you sort of can move it, the court can move itself and issue directives on everything from urban planning to, what gas buses should use and so on and so forth. And the legislature, obviously, in a parliamentary system, is the executive. The executive comes out of the legislature. So we don't have that. We don't have that separation of powers. But what has tended to happen in India when parliamentary power falls in the hands of one particular party or becomes very concentrated, the Supreme Court becomes positioned as a kind of big check, as a kind of counter-sovereign. Now, of course, we should not be blind to the class element here, right? Those people, that set of people who can move the Supreme Court and who can navigate its arcane methods are a particular class of people, to be sure. right? And they probably won't find much success in electoral government. And where they lose out in politics, they sort of strike back, if you like, in through the courts. And that is what is happening in our current period. You get a kind of constitutional awakening precisely at the moments when the executive power reaches and indeed overreaches to try and disturb the equilibrium that we have. And again, without making a kind of false equivalence between the kind of Nehru-Gandhi period, the Congress period. Obviously, Congress comes in for plenty of bashing, and I'm happy to bash them anytime. But you can see this trend pretty clearly, right? Nehru and the left part of the Congress were wary of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, from the progressive point of view in this period, the Supreme Court shows up as a conservative force, right? Because what is one of the big agenda, right on independence, what is the big agenda? It is land reform. The whole industrial policy of Nehru depends critically on land reform. Because all of the productivity gains that the industrial policy was going to get was all our precious savings and all of our foreign exchange that we had earned during the war and so on and so forth. All of that was going to go into industrialization. So how were you going to get productivity gains in agriculture? You were going to get it from this point of view on the cheap, and you were going to get it, in other words, without heavy investment. You were going to get it through land reform. So land reform, if land reform failed, you wouldn't get agricultural productivity, you would starve, you wouldn't basically have enough food to feed your people, and the whole system would come, the whole Manalobis kind of agenda would come a cropper. So land reform was not merely a social agenda. Of course it was. The zamindars were seen as the enemy under the nationalist movement, during the period of the nationalist movement, holding up part of the empire. So there is a social agenda, but it is absolutely critical to the economic agenda, right? And of course, what stands in the way of land reform? The right to property, enshrined in the constitution. A huge failure from the Nehruvian standpoint. A huge failure. Why the hell is right to property even there? He didn't have enough power in the Constituent Assembly not to put right to property. The right wing, as it were, snuck it in there. And about 40-50% of the cases, the early cases in the Supreme Court, are precisely zamindars taking the center to court to block land reform. So you can see why the progressives would construe the state in this period as a conservative force, right? The very first amendment of the Constitution, which happens, the ink is barely dry, 1950. If I'm not mistaken, 1950 is the first amendment, creates this thing called the Ninth Schedule, where whatever you stuff in the Ninth Schedule, the courts can't look at, right? So there's this tussle between these two sovereign powers. The Parliament, representing the sleeping sovereign, as it were, in Richard Tuck's phrase, the people, and the Supreme Court. Nehru wants to put directive principles higher than fundamental rights, and so on and so forth. Even though, with all of that, his strong state agenda, there was still obviously a broadly liberal push. Mrs. Gandhi is a whole different matter altogether, right? Her sort of Rasputin figure who's in the background, this chap called Mohan Kumaramangalam, who's a left buddy of hers from Cambridge, comes up with the idea of a committed bureaucracy and a committed judiciary. Committed to what? Committed to the cause of social justice, committed to the cause of social transformation. And they try to push through these amendments that push through the social agenda. But pretty soon, even people on the Congress left, you think of people like Chandrasekhar, started getting suspicious that progressive for Mrs. Gandhi was a kind of code word for the will of Mrs. Gandhi. And you start getting this kind of the halo of the nationalist movement which of course was carried by Nehru, starts to look a bit shoddy, starts to chip away, and this kind of political self-interest starts to kind of creep in. So there's this tussle that's set up between the sovereign trying to push its social agenda, a little bit now starting to look like bad faith, and the Supreme Court trying to preserve the Constitution. It's out of this tussle that you get the Golaknath case in 1967, which starts to think about this idea of the basic structure. In fact, basic structure comes in Keshavananda Bharati, which is after that, but this idea that the parliament cannot touch certain fundamental rights. That's not part of its agenda. And the court here is playing a kind of, it pushes back very strongly in 67 in Golaknath. In Keshavananda Bharati, the parliament then strikes back. Keshavananda Bharati strikes back again, and there's this kind of messy compromise. Even Keshavananda Bharati, which is like held up as the case that outlines that, basic structure can't be touched, basic structure can't be touched. The court is playing a clever game. It's trying to retain its power even while protecting the democracy, protecting the fundamental rights. So it says, even in Keshavananda Bharati, it says, the state can limit fundamental rights for, a certain kind of social legislation. It can't alter the basic structure, but it leaves what is basic structure quite ambiguous, right? It uses the phrase basic structure, but what is included in the basic structure in the 73 judgment is rather ambiguous. What it does solidify is the right to judicial review. Whatever the parliament does, we will review it, right? And this is cemented in subsequent cases in various ways, Minerva Mills and so on and so forth. So we have a political court. Political in the sense that it reads the political tea leaves and it tries to position itself in a certain way vis-a-vis the Constitution, and it acts in a kind of, it acts not as a true liberal, of which I'm not one, but a true liberal would wish the court to act in a principled way. But the court doesn't actually act in a principled way, it acts in a more or less pragmatic way, trying to balance out, even secularism, even you read judgments on secularism, the judges will keep saying they are very religious people, they believe in this, they believe in that, but in a country like India, secularism is required, right? So it's not a principled secularism, it's a kind of pragmatic secularism. It's a modus vivendi, it's an agreement to disagree kind of secularism, right? So that is the kind of court, and perhaps our strongest liberal voice in the country, the captain of the liberals, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, has a very nice phrase. He says, the Supreme Court has given enough players, enough partial victories to keep everyone interested in the power of the court. Like, why would this court, why is this court legitimate? Where does it derive its power from? It derives its power from the fact that in this compromise game that it plays, in this balancing game that it plays, it gives enough players, enough partial victories that they are interested in its power and in its autonomy. Its autonomy, by the way, which is itself guaranteed by a judgment in 1993 called the third judge's case rather, where it appoints itself through a collegium of judges. So it in this case it secured autonomy, but at the cost of some transparency. We don't know exactly what goes on in that collegium. It's not a public. It's kind of like, when the Pope is kind of anointed, you see black smoke or red smoke or green smoke or whatever comes out. It's, for such a powerful body, it's not exactly the most transparent. Now, you can read this, and I certainly read this in two ways. The fact that the court is political in the sense of a small p political is also a good thing, because it means that the social movements that then emerge, even if they don't manage to capture political power formally through parliament, still have the ear of the court, right? And that is why what is now happening in the country, all across the country, is very, very important, because the court will have to, in its practice, take cognizance of this. A popular upsurge can move the court. So that's the upside. What's the downside? The downside is that this lack of transparency has unfortunately created a channel through which the Supreme Court can become committed, but not in the Mrs. Gandhi Mohan Maramangalam sense of committed, where they were trying to do it formally through constitutional amendments. Because of the lack of transparency, it can become committed, I use this somewhat sarcastically, through corruption. Right? The administrative power of the court, and especially the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, is such that, and the murkiness that is there, is such that it leaves itself open to be compromised by an overmighty parliament. Not through formal means, but through the informal means of corruption rather than legislation. I'm winding up. So in summary, we have our three sovereigns. We have the people who exercise sovereignty through a political struggle and through the formal means of a constituting body like the Constituent Assembly. You have a parliament who might be characterized as a vanguard turned autocrat. Right? It used to be a vanguard, and now it's a bit of a bully. And we have a Supreme Court that's corruptible but accessible as a kind of counter-sovereign. Right? These are our three sovereigns. But let me finish by making a quote from a very eccentrically named American judge called Learned Hand. Again, this is a quote from Pradhabanu Mehta, who's Learned Hand has a very nice quote, and he says, quote, "Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies in the hearts of men and women, no constitution, no law, no court can ever save it. No constitution, no law, no court can even do much to help it." Right? So I know that we're all looking to the Constitution and we're looking to the Supreme Court, but that is a defensive measure, and that is deference to one kind of sovereignty. And it's understandable why we would look to that in a moment where progressive forces are weakened. But that can only be a holding position. Ultimately, we have to look to the ultimate sovereignty, the ultimate sovereign, which is us. So I would simply end by saying, don't merely look to the court, look to each other. Thanks.
Thank you, sir, for your amazing lecture. So, to conclude, we can say that we are a democratic sovereign in which there is no Indian who is excluded. In Indian sovereign republic, it's people who makes rules for themselves through the elected leaders. And if there is any dispute between the state and people, we have the Indian judiciary, which plays a crucial role in such cases. So, we'll be starting the Q&A session. So, if anyone has the question, you can ask to the sir.
I have one. Can I go first? Can I get faculty privilege?
Anush, I thought that you were sort of hinting there, but a very specific thing. So this is something that needs to be like very pointedly said. Am I audible at all? That the original NRC project, which has a much longer history than what is happening under this present administration, a huge impetus to the project, especially the creation of the detention camps, was not actually a parliamentary decision, but it was something initiated by, as you correctly mentioned, a political court. It was RXCGI Gogoi, right? And the language of that instruction to the government has, like, it's very instructive if one is to read that language. And then a further degree of, I would say, judicial invention happens when Mr. Harsh Mandar, one of our civil society luminaries, he takes a PIL to the SC in front of Mr. Gogoi, and Gogoi sort of very inventively interprets what Mr. Mandar wants. What he wanted was transparency in the camp building business, and what Mr. Gogoi says is that hence it's the will of the court to accelerate the camp building measures. So in front of the question is that in front of that degree of what I would call malified activism, how do the people even defend their rights? Because the idea being that when the parliament goes after your rights, you go to the Supreme Court. What happens when, well, I'm like, to be more specific would be to invite contempt charges.
Are there any more questions? I can take that one.
Anush, very nice lecture. So, I think we by nature and by experience are quite imitating in nature. Hello. Yeah. So thanks for the nice lecture. I was just saying that to me it looks like whatever institutions we have built, it is largely imitating in nature. We have imitated all kinds of practices in the world, and I mean, if you look at even Gandhi, I mean, he basically imitated Tolstoy and other figures like Thoreau, etc. So the point which I'm trying to make is that when you say that we are sovereign, I mean, what is original which you think it is in India we practice? Because largely, I mean, to me it looks like whatever we practice, it is some sort of a copy of what others are practicing in the world.
So my question is this. So when you said that people are sovereign, I would like to ask, who are these people? Because we have taken for granted the concept of people over here. Secondly, when we say sovereign, what it means to be a sovereign? Does a sovereign stands above the law and yet can intervene within the legal system? And also who can and who has the capacity to decide over anything? Do you mean to say that? Thank you.
Thanks for those questions. The third, sovereign. If the parliament is locked out and if the court is locked out, you have to go to the people, and that's precisely what's happening, right? That when this jugalbandi between the state and the court goes off the rails, people are on the street. And the beautiful thing about it is that there's another idea of the constitution, not the written down constitution, but the kind of grammar of politics in a particular place. When you violate that grammar, that basic everyday understanding of what is it that makes a certain place tick, you don't have to organize, because everyone already feels that in their heart, right? And so that is what is happening now. For all the massive investment in PR and electioneering and so on, the ruling dispensation has not managed to capture the hearts and minds of the Indian people. Right? We are, in a sense, the people who are coming out on the street spontaneously are proving that point. Right? We are the majority. We are the majority. The people who are trying to push the country in a particular Puritan direction are entirely in the minority. They're just better organized than we are. So we have to get a bit better organized. I mean, that's a very big question. I agree that there's some degree of imitation, but I wouldn't go quite as far as to say that it's all simply copied, right? All forms of learning are mimicry. I don't think you can have any learning without mimicking and copying to a certain extent. But similarly, you can't have any copy. You copy and you innovate simultaneously. I think Gandhi is extremely inventive. He has different sources of copying, and when you all put it together, you get the kitchery that is Gandhi. Similarly, with at some broad abstract level, we have a constitution, and that's a copy, but it's entirely ours, and we continue to innovate on it all the time. So I wouldn't be we are to some extent derivative, but we are not entirely derivative. So I don't know if I'd go with you there. If you were to ask me what is the most original part, I think it's where there are various syntheses. I can't tell you sort of right off the top of my head, but I would disagree somewhat with the underlying premise. The third question, sorry, I don't know your name, in terms of the relationship between the sovereign and the law. At least if you ask Rousseau, and this is the idea of the constituting power, the sovereign will is the law. That's all the law is. It is merely what the sovereign says. Right? And how did we constitute, when you quite rightly say, who are the people who constituted our constituent power, namely the Constituent Assembly? They were not elected, or they were elected, as Professor Robinson was saying, on a very narrow franchise. But we had a referendum on that constitution. That was the first election. The first election of the free India was a referendum on that constituting power. And so we ratified it. We, all of us, in that election, ratified that constitution. And if you hold the position that of the distinction between the sovereign and the government, you would have to basically have a new constituent assembly acting as a sovereign body to then reconstruct the basic grammar. Of course, Parliament is given the right to amend the constitution in the constitution itself. And there are various methods, and various parts of the constitution can be, amended by different methods, and some by a simple vote, some by a 2/3 vote, some with, some parts with a 2/3 or 50% of the states, and so on and so forth. It is certainly amendable, and to that extent, in those moments when the Parliament is amending the constitution, it is doing so with its hat as the sovereign, namely as having constituent power. But this distinction is important because all laws are not the kind of deep structure laws, right? The deep structure laws, those are the laws that pertain to sovereignty. The everyday laws are a kind of different matter. So that's why that distinction is not uncontested, by the way. I mean, there are very many people, Grotius, Puffendorf, and so on and so forth, who dismiss this distinction. But it seems to have some veracity in this context. See the question over here.
Yeah, I don't need the microphone. Okay. Thanks for the perspective. I have a kind of a broader net kind of a question.
Sure.
So you talked about... So, can you hear me now? So you talked about the three sovereign, and you also talked about liberty from social evils, poverty, as well as sort of the British. Which, according to you, which government or which of the three sovereigns have been able to, do anything about the other sovereignty, the other evils that we were seeking freedom from? Because patriarchy, social evils continue to exist, and I wonder what your thoughts are.
Sure.
There's one.
Yeah, over here.
So you said that if there is a jugalbandi between government and the court, you have to go to the people. So what is the solution if majority of the people supports this jugalbandi? Like we are seeing nowadays. What is the solution? Will this lead to civil war?
We've made some progress on social justice. It's obviously extremely incomplete, but I couldn't point to a single, probably more early than late, but it's an ongoing process, right? The problem, of course, is that it's not about the governments, but it's about social movements. And if you have single point social movements, in our electoral system, they don't scale. That's the problem. And so you have to have a kind of omnibus idea and an omnibus narrative within which all of these movements for social justice can kind of climb on board, and then you can scale, right? That's what the nationalist movement was. And that's what Hindutva is. Right? Hindutva offers, if you like, marginal Sanskritization to excluded Hindus. Right? And that's its kind of promise. And they're like, yeah, great, that sounds fantastic. We'll climb on board, right? Of course, it excludes a lot of people. But that is the electoral political success of it, right? It manages to be, and that, by the way, was the original Yogendra Yadav conception of the Aam Aadmi Party, right? The idea that I've just told you is Yogendra Yadav's idea. You need a critical scale to get going. So you can have Narmada Bachao, you can have all these brilliant social movements that our civil society is replete with, but none of them will scale unless you give them all a platform on which to come onto, and then you're in the game of in a first past the post system. So I think that's the trick, is to scale them, and you know, if you have any ideas about how to do that, I'd love to know, because it's a tough call. Liberty lies in the hearts of people, Learned Hand says. No constitution can change that, no law can change that. You simply have to change hearts and minds. There is no shortcuts. There's no shortcuts, right? Weber says that the politics is the slow boring of hard boards. You cannot get away from that job. In a sense, to look to the constitution is itself a shortcut.
We have 24/7 mainstream media.
But we are 24/7 people.
How many, sir?
All of us. We're
More than you would think.
we are, I'm actually quite convinced about this after looking at these months of protest. We are the majority. But we are broken up. We have to come together, as I was saying earlier. But we are the majority. You see, think about it like this. India is a khichdi. The idea of this kind of a pure identity is the most anti-Indian thing you can think about. It's deeply anti-Indian. I'm a Parsi. No one's going to challenge my Indianness. But I don't fit in that concept of India. Right? And there's many other people who don't. So the idea of purity is an anti-Indian idea. It just doesn't understand what India is about. And that's why you don't need organization. That's why people have come out by themselves. Because people know that in their heart. They don't trust them. And they understand that they have a kind of idea of India that goes against the grain. So I would contest the idea that it's a majority thing. You know what the BJP's vote share is? BJP's vote share in 2014, 30%. 32%. BJP's vote share in this year, this election 2019, 37%. They are not a majority position. In the North Indian states, they have a vote share of, you know, some maybe 58, 59%. In Region C, which includes all of South India and going up to the East India and Northeast, 27% vote share. The BJP is a provincial outfit. They are utterly provincial outfit. They just said that they can, you know, they can project. And this is what all good politics does. It projects a part as the whole. But they are a part. Don't be convinced that they are the majority. We are the majority.
I have a question. It's more like I'm trying to understand government and the bureaucracy. You know, with my limited knowledge, they would come under parliament as part of the sovereign, but at the same time, they are also people. So, can you, expand that part a bit, please? Help me understand.
Other questions? Other thoughts? Over here.
It's an extension of the question that came from there. I mean, you laid out three parts of the sovereign, but over.
It's a half-baked idea.
Yeah. But I mean, to add to that mix, do you not think this government has been working its way through? Its governance through PR, right? A large part of its agenda is basically governance through PR. So it targets any dissent by now calling people at Shaheen Bagh paid protesters, so on and so forth. And How do we grapple with this idea of a government which is very comfortable in assassinating the character of its own, of the people that it is supposed to represent?
Yeah, so our democracy is kind of representative, but like as you were indicating, the sovereign lies with the people. So wouldn't it be better if we had a maybe delegatory democracy where the people have the power to revoke the people already in places of power, so that it has a check, things have a check.
So, bureaucrats are people too. Yeah, bureaucrats are people too, but they bear an office. So it depends on what hat you're wearing. Right? The same person can wear 10 different hats. When you're wearing the hat of a bureaucrat, you're part technically of the executive, because they are the ones who, and they also create administrative law, bureaucrats, right? So a law, when it's passed by parliament, is a very very abstract thing. That has to be filled out and in order to be implemented. And so the bureaucrats actually do make laws. It's not the law in the nature of the legislature, but they are rules, right? You get office order XYZ, right? They take their authority from a piece of legislation, but then make it more granular. And so they have a lot of power, but they are technically doing execution. So they would be different when they are people voting versus people in the office of, say an IIT professor. As you know, IIT professors and IIT staff are bound by our service rules, which is why when we do such things as we're doing now, we have to operate with the disclaimer that we're doing it in our personal capacity, right? So that means I'm taking my hat as an IIT professor off and putting my hat as a citizen on. Right? It's a different. So again, in a complex division of labor, people will occupy different roles, and when they occupy, so they can sort of do it in that way. Government by PR, hearts and minds. You just have to be able to reach people, right? Everyone has the means of production in the media business have never been more distributed, right? You have to be able to take those, grab them and reach people. Lots of people have cell phones now, and of course, the most organized body has grabbed that and gone with it with WhatsApp University and so on and so forth. One way to be able to do that is to reconstruct the voice of the expert, reconstruct the authoritative voice. The problem now is that the voice of the expert is problematic, of course, because it can just be the patriarch saying I'm the expert, right? So you can have different kinds of social power acting in bad faith as expertise, and so the problem of expertise is not unproblematic, or the issue of. However, without the issue of the authority of the expert, it's just a free-for-all. It's just fake news. It's just, I can just say anything, and if I say it enough, that becomes true, right? So it has never been tougher to be a journalist. It has never been tougher to be a university professor. It's never been tougher because now everyone has access to all kinds of information, and they can always say, well, where did you get your expertise from? Who paid you? Who paid for the research? Etc., etc., right? So there's always the way to undermine the experts. But unless we cultivate a healthy respect, also a healthy cynicism for a certain kind of expertise, both at the journalistic level and at the research level, we are in big trouble. We are in very big trouble, right? And that, I don't know how to sort of answer that. All I can say is that we've been shocked by the idea that so much information is available. We think information is the same thing as knowledge. And information is not the same thing as knowledge. Information is deeply not the same thing as knowledge, right? You have to have a lot of experience and expertise in a particular field to claim knowledge. So I think insisting on the distinction between information and knowledge is part of the way is part of the way out of that. But we also have to grab the means of mediation and use that to our end. I'm not entirely sure I understand the delegatory system that you're talking about. We do have a recall system. It's a periodic election. Right? If you don't like the government, you throw them out. Right? So I'm not sure that technical fixes are always, in terms of the rules, are always going to help. They may help in some cases. I'm not sure they're going to always help in most cases. I think it's just a question of mobilization given the existing rules. See, here's the problem. As soon as you start tinkering with the rules, people will say, oh, but you got an outcome because the rules changed, not because people think differently. Right? So it's like shifting the goalposts. So the legitimacy of the outcome becomes easier to attack, especially in the context of all of this fake news and so on and so forth. So I think it's a question of let's not look for too many technical solutions. That would be my kind of knee-jerk response to that. We have a system to kick them out. It's called periodic election. By the way, let me just say, I was looking at the, part of my concern with the current movement is that it's happening so early in the election cycle. 2024 is the next Lok Sabha election. How do we sustain momentum for all that time? Every state, almost every state in the union is going to go to assembly elections between now and 2024. And if state elections go the wrong way for the BJP, they'll be jammed in the Rajya Sabha. Right? So the nice thing about Indian democracy is that there's always an election somewhere at some point. Right? So we have to make every election at the assembly level a referendum on this government and use every opportunity to check its power. And it can happen. It can absolutely happen.
Good evening, sir. Sir, you said that India is a khichdi. But the constitution makers, when the constitution was designed, there was no mention of word secular. The secular word was mentioned in the Indira Gandhi regime.
Correct.
So what does this indicate? Our constitution makers were not visionary of the idea of secularism or something like that. Thank you, sir.
Question over here.
Good evening. This is to add to the question about bureaucrats also being people. In the recent past, we have had IAS officers giving up their posts, and that makes me wonder whether such empowered voices would be better functioning within the system and addressing the issue by addressing it from within the system, or does it really help when they step out of those roles?
I have a related question. But there is also the other side where people within the system have this very strong leaning, ideological leaning. How does that, and this is related to her question I think, how does that influence or how do we counter that?
I don't have all the answers, guys. Just FYI. What's the first question? Secularism. So, as I was saying, yeah, Indira Gandhi did one of the amendments to put in secular and socialist. But in a sense, we didn't have to put it there because it's redundant. When you say something is redundant, it means it's already implied. Secular, as I was saying earlier, is we can take out the word secular from the preamble. It's fine because secular is already implied in democratic. Right? The concept of democracy already includes the concept of secularism in it. So to say it separately is mere repetition. Right? So let me explain how. I explained it earlier also briefly. What is the opposite of secularism? The opposite of secularism is a state religion. Right? An official religion of the state, like Pakistan or Israel. Why is that undemocratic? Right? The Israeli state makes a big claim about being Jewish and democratic. Right? that's inconsistent. You can't be both Jewish and democratic. You can't be anything religious and democratic. Precisely because democracy is more than majority rule. If democracy as a concept means mere majority rule, it can't also mean majority rule, because for the minorities, majority rule is just fear. And fear is not democratic. So democracy must mean something more than majoritarianism. It must mean something more than that. It means equal respect for every citizen, whoever has won the election. After all, the loser in an election doesn't stop being a part of the state. They are still citizens, right? So the concept of a state religion, as you have in Pakistan, or indeed Iran, or in Israel, and to some extent in the US as well, right? Every US president said, ends the speech with, God bless America, God save America. They all swear on the Bible. It's kind of crypto state religion. Why is that undemocratic? Because especially in a country that has multiple religions in it, the people who are from the religion other than the state religion, or indeed who may have no religion at all, they may be atheists or agnostic or whatever, they cannot see a state with a state religion as their state, because basically that state is saying your religion is rubbish because we have an official religion. So that person in that state, right, if the official state religion is religion X, a person from religion Y is, by that very fact, becomes a second-class citizen, which is in fact exactly the rationale of the BJP and the NRC, that Hindus are second-class citizens in Islamic Republic. That's absolutely right. And their aspiration is to make Muslims second-class citizens and in India. So you see, so the concept of secularism is already embedded in the concept of democracy. I wouldn't have any problem taking it out. I mean, it's because democracy itself already contains that. I agree with you. I think better to fight from within than to fight without. I always find this gesture of resigning to be a bit kind of, now, who knows what pressures people are under. They may have been under all kinds of pressures, and sometimes if the nth person resigns, then the n-1 person's hand is strengthened. So in the abstract, it's hard to say what is the optimal strategy, stay and fight, protest, resignation, and so on and so forth. But I tend to agree, and especially because it sort of becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If all the right-thinking people leave, then only people left are the nutters. So you, in a sense, have to occupy that post and fight it out. And this especially goes for the idea there. So I agree. What has happened, especially in the bureaucracy, over the last 20, 30 years, has been a brain drain, has been a huge flight out, right? And so that has to be corrected in a certain way. But would you then impugn someone for resigning because they've been under a lot of pressure? Hard to do without knowing it on a case-by-case basis. But broadly speaking, I agree with you. I don't know how long the organizers want to go on for. If people are happy to stay, I'm happy to stay.
Is there any other question?
Yeah. There are a couple of them.
Thank you, sir, for the lecture. So you mentioned in one of your answers to treat this assembly elections as a referendum on the central government, central administration. The problem, so that was sort of how some elections in the previous cycle were painted. There was probably, I think, Gujarat was somehow sort of fought in that manner, and BJP won it. So then that gives all those news channels an opportunity to claim how the Modi wave is now turned into a tsunami and this and that. So it might end up being problematic is what I feel. So what would you say?
Now my question is just as the person has different person has different perspective. Of course. And this thing is happening on, as you said, we have to distribute our information so that we gather. But as I know, as for my experience, I saw there are if you read one newspaper, then your thought process will be going to be regarding that newspaper also. Even though it is Times of India, it is the Hindu, all have some centric. Even though it also happened with the news channels also, not even in one. All the news channels have some certain ideas. So biasness. So how we just spread, and how as a person can go with common goal of achieving any change in the.
Should I take these two?
Sorry.
So you said we are in majority, but as the protest we can see only in colleges and metropolitan cities. And what I think that BJP is successful by spreading their messages through the social media as well as by the mainstream media, the news channels, that this bill is right. That's why we are not able to see the protest in the villages. What do you want to say on this?
So I'll take the second two questions together because they're sort of related. But just to answer the first one first, is there a risk? Of course there's a risk. But you can't compare the situation to the Gujarat elections or the previous cycle of assembly elections for one simple reason. This has happened. This has now happened. That was not the case then. There's a kind of irreversibility now, right? This has now happened. And that means that don't undermine or underestimate what is happening. When legitimacy slips, when the mask slips, very hard to reconstruct it again. Which is why my fear is actually not more elections. My fear is the suspension of elections. I mean, the National Security Act has just been imposed in Delhi for 3 months. That's an emergency, guys. Right? So, why is that happening? Because when the forces of hegemony, of being able to construct a common sense in your favor, when those engines start to ebb because people are no longer buying what you're selling, what's the only strategy that's left? It's just force, just sheer, brutal state power of our post-colonial state, which has many, many colonial provisions, as I was saying earlier, continued along, right? So that's actually my fear. I don't care about losing an election. Sure, election you win, you lose, fine. They're going to say whatever they're going to say, whether you win or lose the election. They're going to, the Goti media is going to try and spin it in whatever happens. So that's a given. But the assembly elections will keep coming up, and opportunities for taking a hack at the government are going to keep coming up. So that's a good thing. Don't take that for granted, right? Because as I say, when the mask slips, all that's left is brute force. So we need to be careful about that. We need our own media. We need another form of mediation. And how to do that is very, very difficult. Right? Basically, in order to get the coverage that we want, we need an independent media. And that means one simple thing. We need to have a different funding structure. And we can do it now because we have crowdfunding. Right? Bernie Sanders in America is running a presidential campaign, which is a very, very expensive affair. Right? And he's raised money from Aam Aadmi and Aam Aurat. Right? In his campaign speeches, he says my average campaign contribution is $27. Not the hundreds and thousands of dollars that you get from corporate media. Right? So there is another funding model available to us in terms of you know what I mean by crowdfunding. Lots of different people come together and fund an independent media. And when lots of people come to do it, it's good because no one interest can capture it. Right? We have the tools of mediation all distributed in the populace. The means of production in the media business are distributed like they've never been distributed before. But the funding structure is not. So if someone is able to crack that, is able to do crowd-funded media with relatively expertise in kind of the editorial structure, you have a very winning formula. IIT students, come on, get inventing, right? Crowdfunding plus independence of the editorial office, plus in-depth investigation. This is a model waiting to happen, right? But we have to believe that that can happen. And to me, all the pieces are in place. We just have to galvanize them. So we need our own media.
Any other question?
I completely agree with what you're saying about alternative media, but I have a couple of friends working in Newsclick and Caravan, which are alternative spaces, and they do face funding issues. But even otherwise, isn't there a limitation in terms of the outreach that such alternatives have? Because you have rural areas where they get dish TV that is given by the government, and those give you only a certain bandwidth of news channels. They don't provide access to all kinds of news channels, and there is an issue of such diverse voices or diverse media voices reaching remotest areas of the country. So how do you think we can address that?
So you mentioned about the colonial laws. One such law was the Section 377, which was rather draconian, which was recently struck down by the Supreme Court. What I'd like to ask you is, ever since independence, the government sort of was very apathetic to it, and now, I don't know, in a sense it has become very anti-queer in a sense. For instance, if you see their opposition to whatever bills that were passed decriminalizing Section 377, and even the trans bill that was passed recently in both the houses. So they talk about legalizing persecuted minorities from the neighboring countries. I'm wondering, when will they legalize us? We've only been really decriminalized. So your thoughts on that? Thanks.
I'm an IITian from the 80s, and in my generation we are talking about a phenomenon called the 2-2-200. Two people for the constitution, two people debating for the adventurism that the government is advocating, and as many as 200 people on the fence. Is this participation here a reflection of that as well? And if so, what can one do to get the fence sitters more involved?
Hello. So my question is, there's a lot of deep state involved in what are the activities. So there's a lot of influence of deep state. So with the influence of the deep state, there is a slow. I mean, the police, so with the concept of the deep state, there's also a slow erosion of trust. I mean, whom do we turn up to? So because of this an erosion of trust, there's somewhat inertia also. Like, why should I go to protest? I mean, why should I stand up for it? It's not it's not personally affecting me. I mean, why do I care? I mean, how do you tackle this inertia which comes?
So thanks, lots of good questions. I don't pretend to have the answers to the media question, but I think the ubiquity of cell phones starts to, and the cheapness of them, has 4G data and so on and so forth, right? I think that last mile connectivity is going to tackle some of the issues that you talk about, and it's only becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So in a sense, they're sowing the seeds of their own destruction, because they're putting out channels for other people to capture, and so we just have to capture them, or at least try and take a cut at them. About fence sitters, I think, as I was saying, I think we're the majority. I think we are the majority, but just broken up, disorganized. The question is how to do that organization and on what scale to do that organization. And as I was saying earlier, it's about finding a kind of omnibus idea to bring people along. And you know, this is not a popular thing to say in necessarily progressive circles, but I think that one such idea is actually nationalism. I don't think that we've exhausted the possibilities of a kind of progressive nationalism. All nationalism isn't progressive. People have an innate sense of belonging and so on and so forth. And certainly India's nationalism is a very peculiar form of nationalism. It's not, India is not France. Unity and diversity means something very serious. And that, I should have said to Amit, I don't know if Amit is still here, that is probably our most original contribution. That is not anything like any other form of nationalism that has happened. Because we are not like any other normal garden variety 19th century European state, right? We are an empire nation. We span a continent. So our form of nationalism is also different as a result. And I think that we need to explore the progressive potential of that idea, even if tactically, and while being cautious of being flanked from the right wing, because of course there's an exclusionary potential in nationalism. About the deep state, let's just call it the bureaucracy, because a deep state sounds sort of conspiratorial or something. They have some own. Listen, a bureaucracy is a machine. Bureaucrats follow orders. Army follows orders. Police follows orders. So just be the one who's giving the orders, right? The person who, the sort of historical sociologist, political economist, whatever you want to call him, Max Weber, who studied bureaucracy, said that, listen, because bureaucracies are a hierarchy, all you have to do is chop off the head. Then whoever's at the head controls the whole machine. Right? That's what, that is in a sense part of the problem. The police is in the hands of the state machinery. Why are protests shut down in UP, but protests can happen in Bombay? Right? Now, so that's part of the incentive. How do you tackle the deep state? Now, if the question is, but it's not affecting my life, at what point are you going to, when your son or daughter is taken away, where your brother and sister is taken away, at what point does it become your problem? There's a domino effect. Today it's not your problem, but it can very easily become your problem tomorrow. Right? So you have to take a stand, because if it affects one of us, because we are sovereign, it affects all of us.
One last question.
Sure.
There was a question you didn't answer.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That's right. I was trying to think there was a fourth question. But that already answers the question for you, doesn't it? That's pretty shameful. Again, it's about, for me, politics is about alliances. Right? Politics is all about alliances, because unfortunately, politics is a game of scale. So it's a question of so the single point issue, and it is a single point issue in a sense, it has to be linked to broader issues of equality, social justice, and so on and so forth. Then it scales. Because otherwise it's too easy for it to be subcritical. And again, I don't pretend to have the answers as to what those alliances look like, but I will say something general about it. Because all politics is about alliances, politics can't be about a pure position. Because if you're going to be Puritan about it, you can't make alliances. In other words, if you're going to hew to your position very strictly and not adjust it to make alliances, you can never make alliances. So I'm not saying that's what the movement does. That's what many movements do. any single issue movement, right? So I would say that that's part of it, is to have an alliance mentality.